All right, so we are at the, by the way, not all of these discourses will necessarily take 2 weeks. There's 14 in all, remember, last week, so I don't think this means that this class will be 28 weeks. Maybe it will, maybe it won't, but just things going on right now prevented me from buzzing right through it. Plus, there was an intro last week as well. So here's the outline we're looking at today. Normally, the outline, what I'll try to do is the structure that Charnock himself gives to the chapter, because he'll have a series of reasons and uses. And I'll talk about that in a second. It's a very Puritan thing to do. And I will have the uses section last. But because there's some loose ends, very briefly at the beginning, I'm going to answer an objection that I've talked about before, and we'll just see how Charnock, how he helps us in answering that. And then these middle sections are going to form the bulk of what we're going to look at today. And I'm just going to combine these because that's what Charnock does. He doesn't really have sections where he talks about concise forms of argument. He either scatters it throughout his chapter, or he gives you the premises, but they're like 2 pages apart, so you really got to be paying attention as a reader. Well, readers used to be able to do that, so it wasn't a problem. We're not as, we like to have 1, 2, 3, boom, right there, about 2-3 inches apart. Well, he doesn't really do that. So you have something of cosmological argument and a teleological argument. In other words, just to put it very briefly, an argument to a first cause and an argument to an end cause in the universe and how that shows us God. And then an argument from mind and from morality. Those kind of go together because there he moves indoors from the creation to inside of man, our thinking, and the moral law and stuff like that. So those are going to kind of go together. As you're reading those sections, you're like, oh, that kind of looks like that's turning into an argument from mind, but he's really talking about the conscience, so he kind of blends it together. So we'll see that, and then we'll talk about practical. And when you see a Puritan use the word uses, that's like your practical application of a sermon part. So because this doctrine is true, here are 5 action items for our life. That's where he's going. Well, here's the main part of the structure of all the chapters, and I collected this from the different pages where he puts it. They're not right one after another, but he gives you 4 reasons that it is folly. Remember how he started? The atheist, Psalm 14:1. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. Why? What do you mean by that? Well, he gives 4 reasons. Reason 1, it is a folly to deny or doubt of that which has been acknowledged sentiment of all nations in all places and all ages. And that was what we looked at the end of last week, that consent of the nations argument, which is often misunderstood. Reason number 2, it is folly to deny that which all creatures or all things in the world manifest. So here you're not putting a microphone up to the creatures and saying, what do you think about that? Here you're looking by creatures, he simply means humans, animals, plants, stars, creatures, literally, in that sense, all created things, Psalm 19, that whole thing. Reason 3, it is folly to deny that which a man's own nature witnesses to him. So in a sense, same thing, now we're moving indoors. Man's thinking, feeling, his longing, and his conscience, all those things. And then reason 4, and last, it is folly to deny the being of God, which is witnessed unto by extraordinary occurrences in the world. And you're like, what? That's not even natural theology anymore. Why would he put this? Because what does he mean by this? Extraordinary occurrences. Well, he divides that along 3 points. First, providential judgments. In other words, extraordinary ways that people or nations have it coming to them. And oftentimes that has to wait till the final judgment, but sometimes not. And so you see that, if you're in the Eastern worldview, you attribute that to karma. But if you have a Christian worldview, and what Charnock is saying, if you're thinking right, that should make you think God's justice. But then also, secondly, miracles, and thirdly, fulfilled prophecy. In other words, this 4th reason has the ring of the second half of a classical Christian apologetics approach, which is prophecy and miracles. You turn to the evidence. Normally, that's not categorized with natural theology. But what Charnock is saying is that these things do, part of their function It's not all of their function, but part of their function is to make us aware of the existence of God, to be convinced of it by various evidences in that sense. Okay. Very briefly, this first section, this is sort of a lingering objection because, if there's one thread that skeptical objections against natural theology and religious objections against natural theology, in other words, arguments coming from unbelievers and arguments coming from believers that don't like natural theology, if there's one thing they have in common, it's this objection. And that is, your conclusion leaves us light years away from, and an atheist will say that differently than a Christian that has a problem with this. A Christian will say something like, that conclusion is not, that's the God of the philosophers. That's not the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or something like that. That's Aristotle's God. That's not the God of Scripture. It's an impersonal thing. It's a static thing. Now, an atheist is going to do the same thing, but he's going to say, you haven't given us a God, much less your biblical or theistic, monotheistic notion of God. This could have been some other kind of first cause. This could have been something else. Well, does Charnock give us any help? Well, here I have in my picture here. This is what this is representing. You see the arrow coming from one of Charnock's statements to the other. As I read Charnock's statements, see this leading to this. And remember the objection. Okay, that's a valid syllogism as far as it goes, but all you've given us is a first cause or a moral law giver cause, something, or some kind of design structure, but you haven't given us the biblical picture of God. You've just given us one thing. Okay, so this guy's thinking hard about this, and here's what Charnock is going to say that I think is going to help us. He says, and this is specific. He uses a specific example. If you say something like, some idea that maybe there's some other being beyond the material realm, but it's not your Christian God, it's just some other being. Why can't it be some other being? Well, Charnock says, if, therefore, an invisible creature made the world, creature, in other words, why can't it just be just like the things in the universe? If it's an invisible creature who made the world, the same inquiries would return. Whence that creature had its being, for he could not make himself. In other words, it still would beg the question, what would be the cause of that? So, you haven't got done with the questions, and many other similar replies could be imagined if you talk about a moral lawgiver or a designer, whatever. Now, notice how he describes his own conclusion to cosmological reason. This is not his only response. If it's even true that there must be a first cause to something in this universe, there's some other things that have to be true too. It begs some other questions. What about that first cause? Keep asking questions, in other words. He says, quote, we must come at last to an infinite, eternal, independent being that was the first cause of this structure and fabric wherein we and all creatures dwell. Notice he comes up with 4 divine attributes that are necessitated. Now, in the rest of his book, he's going to show you ways that, well, if it's a first cause, well, then it can't be, mutable, right? Changeable. If it's changeable, that change is an effect. And every effect has to have a cause. Oh, a first cause, by definition, has to be immutable. Well, it can't be temporal, because if it's temporal, it's in a sequence. And if it's in a sequence, then it's in a sequence. It wasn't first. Oh, a first cause must be eternal. And so on and so on and so on with infinity and so forth. In other words, if you even have just that, you have all the other attributes, and he's going to show you in all those different ways how that's the case. And that's why I said, and in the apologetics class, this is like the laziest objection I've ever heard in my life against almost anything. And yet it's a very prevalent objection against natural theology. You've just given us that. And it's like that big. It can fit in 3 inches. And it's like, keep thinking? Do you have something better to do? Drink some coffee, man. I can't understand why thinking people settle for that kind of an objection. So he insists that this first cause must necessarily exist. He says, quote, it must be infinitely perfect. So we can see that our ability to keep going, keep asking more questions, what else must be true, about natural theological conclusions, it's not just a matter of pragmatics. Charnock is saying it's a matter of necessity. If this is true at all, the whole rest of the thing's true, and I'll show you. That's what Charnock's saying. Come with me on this journey, and I will show you that this implies all the other things too. That's how logic works. Reality's connected. So, he gets to this first category that, again, he mingles together cosmological and teleological reasoning. He kind of treats it together. And he talks about design, but when he talks about design, he talks about it in the sense of the first cause. So, like I said, he mingles this together. Here's what he says. If the universe were, as some fancy, made by an assembly of atoms, there must be some infinite intelligent cause that made them. Some cause that separated them, these atoms. Some cause that mingled them together for the piling up of so comely a structure as the world. It is the most absurd thing to think that they should meet together by hazard and rank themselves in that order we see without a higher and wiser agent, so that no creature could make the world. So you'd recognize that more as a design argument, especially when it gets to the second half of it. Look at the structure of it. You think that happened just by chance? That's kind of the way you hear that. And that is what he's saying. But he's also talking about what I'm going to call ordered systems. And you could think of something as complex as an atom or as DNA, which is more complex, made up of that and structured as a language, made up of proteins, but it's a language. Or you could think of something as simple as Legos. I know Legos appeal to some people, and so I use that example, because it too is an ordered structure. That's kind of what Charnock's saying there, is look at certain attributes of these things. That doesn't just happen, but it's not just us saying it doesn't just happen, okay? Now, when you talk about order and perfection, of course, you're assuming that the person you're talking to grants that there's such a thing as order and perfection. Some people will see where you're going and they'll deny that. But that's absurd, because they're words that deny it. He's expecting you to take it in order, that his words are an ordered system, that his sentences go together. They don't just fall apart, that they maintain their meaning and so forth. In other words, if what you're looking at is a system, well, then it's distinguished from everything else in your field of vision that's not the same system. And it begs the question as to how that system came to be. So this is also a first cause argument. By the way, pay attention when Charnock gets to the simplicity of God. One of the arguments for the simplicity of God is just the reverse of this same thing. These things can't be true of God. If you have a system of ordered parts, it begs the question as to who did the ordering, or what, if you would just want to say what. What ordered these parts? What arranged them? Do these parts have a relationship to each other? If they don't have a relationship to each other, there's no each other. They're not a system. They're not distinguishable. That chair wouldn't be distinguishable from the carpet. But we do distinguish them. We treat them as two distinct things, which means that we treat their parts in relation to each other in some way that the parts of the other thing does not have the relationship to. And that demonstrates that there is an ordering principle. Something relates them to each other, which means that relationship is an effect. That relationship is not the first cause. It was ordered by something external to it, anytime you have distinguishing features. So this is what I mean by what Charnock is talking about is not just a teleological argument. It's not just about design, and isn't that, in a sense, beautiful and elegant, and it couldn't have just come by chance. It's also a cosmological first cause argument, because the same thing shows us that it has to be an effect. Okay, so what follows from this? And he uses other examples. He says, we see not a river, but we conclude a fountain. It's a very old-fashioned way to say that. Anytime we see a river, we conclude a fountain. Why? Rivers go that way. From where? Right? So it's just, that doesn't mean we always think about that, but he's saying that you should, and you know this, is what he's saying. In fact, the reason you don't think about it as often as you don't is because you already know this. It's duh It comes from somewhere. A watch, but we conclude an artificer. That's right back to William Paley's argument. You come up to the watch in the woods and you say, well, that's not just there the same way the stone is. And then he says, as all number begins from unity, so all the multitude of things in the world begins from some unity, oneness, as the principle of it. It is natural to arise from a view of those things to the conception of a nature more perfect than any. So the orderer of order is more perfect than the order that it ordered. Sorry for the tongue twister, but that's what he's saying. The cause of order is in fact more orderly than the thing that has been ordered. It requires an orderer because it requires mind. There's a certain form that this thing takes that requires what Paley called contrivance. Now, of course, this is 130 years before Paley's argument, 120 years. The principle of workable order that Charnock, he uses the expression, a harmony of all the parts. That's what he calls it. He would have said the same thing about the Legos as he would about an atom. Or of course, he didn't see the double helix in his day. Okay, true, but he would call them a harmony of all the parts. Now, if you think about this for a moment, you start to have just more language or more conception for arguing back against the famous arguments of Hume in his dialogues, when he's so critical of all that pain and suffering in the world and futility and waste and senselessness and things not working. They're only as prevalent as they are. They're only as noticeable as they are, precisely because the vast majority of things in this universe actually do work. You would not notice your body breaking down unless bodies were workable things. So a breaking down body or a car presupposes a workable body and cars. You wouldn't notice the one if the other was not the norm. Okay? So these things are systems with ordered parts. There's no such thing as disorder apart from order. Order comes first. Comes first in your mind, not just in reality. It's your backdrop. It's the thing that makes sense of all the things we're complaining about. That these things are not as they ought to be. What do you mean by that, if there's no such thing as ought to be? So what Charnock means by this harmony of the parts, he says, well, I don't have this on the board, but anyway, he says this harmony appears in three things. One, the linking of contrary qualities. You think contrary, well, the A versus the C, and the G versus the T in the proteins, or the electrons versus the nucleus, orbiting. Well, I guess in Legos you could say the green versus the blue, or the top versus the bottom, or you get the idea. Secondly, the subservience of one thing to another, which of course requires the opposition in the first point. The subservience of one thing to another, words hierarchy. He uses the examples of heavenly bodies and the lower world, centering on man, that it's regular, uniform, and constant. And third, in the admirable variety and diversity of things in the world. So when he says harmony of the parts, he means the harmony of the parts in those systems, and then he means the harmony of the parts in a larger system. Think of an ecosystem or a symbiotic relationship between, a fungus and a tree. I don't know why I went there, but symbiotic relationship, ecosystems, social systems, economic exchange, and so on. So 1 Corinthians 12, the parts of the body. I know an atheist wouldn't accept that, but I'm just trying to say this is the kind of thing that Charnock is talking about. Okay? Now, when he comes more specifically to end cause or design, you see that one of the most simple objections to the argument against design, he turns on its head. The argument itself is brief. Again, 3 parts. Several creatures have several ends. Secondly, they know not their ends. They don't know their ends. Think of the arrow, again, going to the target. Therefore, there is some superior understanding and nature that so acts them. Again, old-fashioned English, that activates them or sets them in motion. And there, Charnock is using the exact argument that Aquinas did in his fifth way. He's basically saying, yeah, I know the arrow doesn't think. I know the rock doesn't think. Your molecules in your body don't think. But they're all ordered and structured to a particular end and not some other. So let me skip some stuff on that. But on the most simple level, he's saying all creatures move to some function in this world. And he puts this in terms of living organisms, that they move to, quote, make use of the natural arms and appetites for their survival. And he looks to Scripture and shows you examples where this isn't just something that you have to pick out of Scripture and say, well, here's an example of that from Scripture. These are actually four examples of Scripture telling you to do it. Scripture's telling you, hey, look at that thing in nature. Look at its design. Then what? That shows you something about God. What just happened? Natural theology. The Scripture commands natural theology. The Scripture says, look at that thing in nature and infer some truth about God. So here's your four examples that Charnock uses. Psalm 8:2, infants. Now this is the least clear of the bunch for a couple of reasons. One, because a baby is more than a cow or a plant, certainly. There's more than nature there, so you may miss it there. You also might miss it because it's a famous verse that Jesus quotes from in the New Testament about how God silences his enemies. Out of the mouths of babes and infants you have ordained praise. You have ordained praise. But what does that mean? Babies, in some way, are praising God, as surely as Psalm 19 say that the stars do. So it's really no problem. Stars don't have a mouth. Stars don't actually literally speak, but in some way they're communicating or declaring. It uses speech language, declares the glory of God. So if stars can do that, or even rocks and stones, when Jesus quoted from this, what did he say when they were complaining about the little children? If these did not cry out, the rocks would cry out. So if stars and rocks can do that metaphorically, I got no problem with a baby's cry being a praise of God. Okay? There's one. Job 39 is a whole chapter. I just picked one of the animals that was used, the oxen. And they're specifically used, God designed the oxen for man to use to fulfill certain ends that man has. They're not his chief end, but they are food. And so it's a good gift that God has given to man. And the animals show that about God, his wisdom, his kindness, provision. Jeremiah 8:7, there's the stork and the swallow. And again, it shows God's design of them. Not just that God himself is feeding them, so it shows God's provision, but he uses secondary causes. The particular way that the birds are wired shows something about God's wisdom and the complexity that he has designed things with. And then finally, Matthew 6:28, the lilies of the field represent beauty. So there's a kind of complexity there, but it's even saying Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed as one of these. So you see there the beauty of creation, and all of that is saying something about God in particular. Okay? So very, very interesting. It's not just a design argument he's making. You actually are dealing with certain ways that Scripture tells you to think like this. Okay? He talks about the body and soul of man, particularly made subject for this kind of reasoning in various scriptures. And so the evidences of divine workmanship can be found in what he says, in the order, fitness, and usefulness of every part, as well as the admirable difference of the features of men. In other words, there's a kind of beauty there in the different wisdoms, the different powers, the different amounts of knowledge. As human beings excel other human beings, this is a tricky one because it's one where we're tempted to envy or covet in one way or another. But Charnock is saying this is actually something that we ought to give thanks to God for and rise above the instruments that it's coming through and to see something about God. So what about when we move indoors from nature out there to the nature in here? I'll get to it in a second. Let me quote Charnock first before I show you my picture. Here's how he says it, how he weaves an epistemological argument, or an argument from mind, from the indoors. He says, we know that we have an understanding in us, a substance we cannot see. Sorry, the word substance before the 20th century, it was from Aristotle. It just meant a particular thing. A substance was just any individual thing. When we hear that word in the modern world, we think falsely, a false kind of scientifically. We think something like, I can rub it together, I can make it disintegrate. That's it's got substance. Yeah, no. And a real physicist would tell you, no, that's backwards. But Aristotle would use that word, and for 23 centuries, that's the way thinking people use that word. So I do have to point that out because it's a little different than today. A substance, so it means an I, a thinking thing. That's what Charnock means, a person. We know that we have a substance we cannot see, but we know by its operations as thinking, reasoning, willing, remembering, and as operating about those things that are invisible and remote from sense. So what did he just say? Let me stop there. So far he said, when we look inside of us, we can see, in quotes, we can perceive an invisible something dealing with invisible somethings. So there's a soul, there's a person who's thinking about myself, thinking about reason, thinking about laws, virtues, obligations that God's laid on me maybe. There's things that we're dealing with that are themselves immaterial, something that you can't simply reduce to the material world. So he says, this must needs be distinct from the body. For that, being but dust and earth in its original, has not the power of reasoning and thinking. For then it would have the power when the soul were absent, as well as when it is present. Besides, if it had that power of thinking, it could think only of those things that are sensible and made up of matter as itself is. So I went into this a little bit in the epistemological argument, especially J.P. Moreland's version of it. All these lines are going to do the same thing, but the first pairing, mind and brain, is kind of where Charnock's statement that I just read was dealing with. He was saying, if you look inside of you, which you do all the time, I'm just alerting you to it. He's saying we always are beholding a certain person that's distinct from the body. He's not saying separate in a Gnostic sense. I know people used to get uncomfortable with this for a little 20-year blip. Fortunately, they're coming out of that. But that if you separate these in any way, that you're a Gnostic and you're saying the body's bad or the body's a prison or whatever else. No. You could, but that's not what the old thinkers were saying. They're just saying it's distinct. It's distinct from the body. And so this mind, this thinking thing, this soul, is doing business not just with the body. He's not denying that you're thinking about apples and seats and paying the bills, but even when you start to think about that, now even about the physical things, you're thinking about invisible, immaterial things. And so Charnock's saying you can't simply reduce this mind to this. And if you could, then the only things you could think of, since this is the only thinking thing, that's not real. In fact, or if we use this word, it's just a strict synonym for this. If that were true, then the only things you could think about would likewise be physical things. So anytime I think of anything, I think of a basketball, that basketball's replicating itself in my mind, just a smaller version of it. So well, that's stupid and silly. Nobody really believes that. Okay, tell me what you do believe if you're just a materialist. What's that thing that just showed up in your brain? Well, it's a spot. It's a chemical. It's like a neuron. It's like what are those things firing off when I take aspirin? My brain isn't working right now. See, my brain is affected. But if that's all it is, it's just affected by stimuli, then you've got problems. And I won't rehash all of those because Charnock doesn't get that specific, but he brings up a good point. He draws out 4 excellencies of the soul that stand above mere matter. Now, he's going to break it down into 4, but this is what I'm going to break down into these 3 basic areas. An epistemological argument, a moral argument, similar to the one Lewis makes, And then he's going to make a very interesting argument from desires or longing, which Augustine does in many of his writings, and Lewis does in many of his writings, but Charnock puts it in a very interesting way in a very short space. But here's how he breaks it down, though, in 4. He says, number 1, the vastness of its capacity, in other words, the soul. We have something in us that has a vast capacity, too vast to be caged in by just the body or even all the things in this world combined. Okay. Secondly, the quickness of its motions, the mind. Third, the union of soul and body. And fourth, the operations and reflections of conscience. So he's going to do that. He lists that in a different order than I have it there. The argument from conscience, that middle one, can be found in places like Lewis, like I said. But he says, Charnock does, as there is a rule in us, there must be a judge. That's why I use the word rule above the line. As there's a rule in us, there must be a judge. Whether our actions be according to the rule, and since conscience in our corrupted state is in some particulars misled, there must be a power superior to conscience to judge how it has behaved itself in its deputed office. We must come to some supreme judge who can judge conscience itself. So let me explain what he did. He just made 2 distinctions. You can't reduce, just like you couldn't reduce this to this, you can't reduce this to how we happen to behave. And it should be sort of fresh in your mind from Lewis's argument. Because we don't all behave the same, we're going to have disagreements about that, but we have some basic idea that we ought to behave a certain way whether we do or not. He also makes a second distinction because he's also saying you can also not reduce this to conscience. Conscience is a sounding board. Conscience is what God's written on, but our own conscience is not God's law. So we also can't take the Jiminy Cricket route, right? Always let your conscience be your guide. It depends what you mean. I can have a guilty conscience. I can have an uninformed, I can have a weak conscience, Romans 14. Or I can have a stronger and weaker based on what? Whether or not it's conformed to God's law, whether it's been informed by God's law. Okay? So this can't be just behavior. It can't be individual perspectives either. There has to be some singular judge that is immaterial, that stands over us. Okay? So he's going to use another argument now. And this will get us to that third one. And it's prefigures Lewis, but if you're familiar with Augustine's writings, he will talk about this in many ways as well. I just happen to use the words, and see my direction now? Now I'm not just going a horizontal line that separates the material from the immaterial. Now I want to have a trajectory. There's a famous way that Lewis says it, I don't even remember where. But it's, we have a desire in us that nothing in this world can satisfy. Augustine says, our hearts are restless until they find their rest in thee. This is the Confessions. So Charnock says, and I'll come back to that. Yeah. It says, the evidence of God results from the vastness of the desires in man and the real dissatisfaction he has in everything below himself. So let me stop right there, below himself. The reason there's a below the line here, a brown, is because there are things in this world, but we are driven to. Remember I said the ox, God gave us the ox. God gives us daily bread. There's nothing wrong with having those as pay my bills. Why are you doing this, Matt? I'm doing this to pay my bills. There's nothing wrong with that, but there's something about it stopping there, okay? That there's something missing. So, man has a boundless appetite after some sovereign good. As his understanding is more capacious than anything below, so his appetite is larger. This affection of desire exceeds all other affections. Love is determined to something known, fear to something apprehended, but desires approach nearer to infiniteness and pursue not only what we know or what we have a glimpse of, but what we find wanting in what we already enjoy. I use the language here that is very common among the Puritans. of a chief end and a subordinate end. There's famous works that talk about this, but even if you haven't read them, what's question 1 of the Westminster Shorter Catechism? What is the chief end of man? Chief end. To glorify God and enjoy Him forever, which doesn't mean there are not subordinate ends. But the thing about a subordinate end is that they have to be properly ordered to their chief end. Otherwise, they become lying, or what Augustine called inordinate desires. That's what coveting is, by the way, the 10th commandment. It's an inordinate desire. It's something that shows up as a subordinate end, but if you dig under the surface, you have here a human being who is seeking for happiness, but he's seeking in the wrong place. He's seeking for permanence, but he's seeking in something that doesn't last, and so on. So a chief end is your ultimate end. It's sufficient, and it has to be a sufficient chief end. You can't simply say, well, yeah, we all have a chief end, namely we all desire to be happy. Well, that's true as far as it goes, but you didn't create yourself, and therefore you didn't even get to decide what will make you happy. You are wrong about what will make you happy if it is not God. So a chief end has to be sufficient to explain man's pursuit of any ends, and this is why it can become an argument for God's existence. By the way, there was an atheist who got this once, and then she stopped short. I'm thinking of a quote, and I was going to quote this in the Theological Week, but it doesn't work as an argument for God's existence because it only applies to human actors. It was Ayn Rand. She wrote a book called The Virtue of Selfishness, which is already problematic. But she thought anyway that she was an admirer of an Aristotle. For her, Aristotle and her were the only people that ever said anything smart. But she talked about human beings driven to actions, and that I would never be driven to an action that's immediate unless there was a more ultimate end that was explaining that and so forth. But this process cannot go on forever. You would never move as a moving being if there was no final end driving all of your motion, setting into motion all the subordinate ends. And you just want to, you're an atheist. Come on, take the next step. But she didn't, because it has to be in itself something which is singular and infinite and so forth. Well, I didn't include that in that week because it really only applies to personal agents. But it does apply to personal agents. Augustine, if you read his books on this subject, what you'll get the idea of, and I think this is what Charnock is getting at, is that in order for something to truly make me happy, and it's not just me, it's for anybody to be a happiness-seeking being at all, for anybody to be a longing being, you need 2 things in this ultimate happiness, or it won't make you happy. It will not drive you. It will come to nothing. It has to be something that is ever increasing. You say, well, how ever increasing? God's not ever increasing. He is who He is, and He's the happiest being. That's true, but He's the creator. We're creatures. We don't have the sum of God, His infinity. We experience Him. And so for me, by the way, why do you get bored? Or why do you need a stronger dosage of something, some illicit thing that you partake in this world? Your senses die out, you get bored with it, you need a stronger dosage. Well, why is that? Why? It's corruptible. So as a finite being, you need an ever-increasing joy. Secondly, it has to be never-ending. If you even think about how you can lose it, let alone if you could lose it, you will not be happy. You will have the sense of fear that it could be lost. So what Augustine was saying, and I think what Charnock is saying here, is that this end cause, this chief end, has to be sufficient. It has to be at least ever-increasing and never-ending. And all human beings have that sense, and it is broken in the fall. And so they're pursuing other things as if they could function in that way. Charnock says it has to be something is, in our goods that are attained in this world, something is still wanting to make its nature more perfect. It has to be a stable good, he says. Okay? So very, very interesting comparing him to Augustine and Lewis on that point. So he says, why is this an argument for God's existence? this might be a good argument for what God must be like to the Christian and how we ought to order our desires, but we already believe that. How is this, in any sense, an argument for God? And this is where Lewis kind of goes, too. Lewis uses the metaphor of a man starving on a raft, that the fact that I am a hunger-seeking being doesn't prove that I will be nourished. I might wind up starving and never find it, but it does prove that I am the kind of being whose body is repaired by food. Okay, and so Charnock says, and shall a man only have a vast desire without any possibility of enjoyment? Nothing in man is in vain. He has objects for his affections, as well as affections for objects. Okay, see what he's saying? He's saying the soul is just like the body in this sense, at least. Your body wouldn't have a need for, your body wouldn't fall asleep at night unless it had a need for sleep. Your body wouldn't go after food unless you had a need, unless you had hunger. So these things are ordered to particular ends. Your soul would not have a desire for something bigger than the world or longer than your life unless there was something bigger than the world, longer than your life. That's what he's saying. Okay, now you can parse that out however you want to, but he's strongly suggesting that this is an argument for God's existence. Okay, last section, I said there is these uses, and this will happen in every chapter, every one of the discourses, is that you'll have these practical applications. And remember, how does it start? It starts with the fool, Psalm 14:1. That being the case, if it's folly in that way, well, then you can bet his uses are going to be colored by us not being guilty of this folly. So, first, it's pernicious to the world and to the atheist himself, namely atheism. Atheism, or this folly, is pernicious, dangerous, destructive to the world and to the atheist himself. Secondly, its growth, atheism's growth, in a season and field of gospel growth is all the more lamentable. Okay? Thirdly, I'll unpack each of these. It is our wisdom, not just our duty, it is our wisdom to be confirmed in the reality of God's existence. Fourthly, it is a folly to know that he exists, but then to not worship him. And that gets into the practical atheism thing. And then fifthly, it is our wisdom to then constantly think of him. So the first one, why is atheism so pernicious to society? That's what he means by the world. Dangerous to society. Now, clearly, so when he says this, don't be a pietist. He's not just saying it's pernicious to the individual, and therefore it's pernicious to groups of individuals too, because those groups will be in hell too. That's true, but that's actually not what he's talking about here. He's saying that in addition to being dangerous to your soul, it actually destroys society and the world. So how is that the case? Well, isn't what somebody believes about God, this is a myth we believe today, isn't that just a private matter? I mean, maybe the individual will be warped, and so directly surrounding him, he may have some pathologies, but surely that's a private matter, and again, that's a myth. First of all, he says, Charnock does, it would root out the foundations of government. Atheism would root out the foundations of government. What? And of course, in our day today, everybody's like, you got to be kidding. So what's the alternative? A theocracy? And that's what the response will be. Well, this is what he says. The sense of a God is the foundation of civic order. Without this, there is no tie upon the consciences of men. What force would there be in oaths for the decision of controversies? What right could there be in appeals made to one who has no being? A city of atheists would be a heap of confusion. So, why is this the case? Is this just something Christians say because they want some kind of a Christian nationalist theocracy, something, Handmaid's Tale, something like that? No. Atheism reframes the whole of one's personal morality. And of course, societies are made up of persons. So the rot would spread both ways, from leaders to the population, from the citizens to the government. There's a verse in Hosea that says, like priests, like people. In other words, as the leadership goes, so goes the people. If you found a society on the basis of godlessness, some people say politics is downstream culture. In other words, Well, yeah, but what we do as a family and schools and churches and blah, blah, and artists, well, that'll give us the kind of leaders we have. Well, that's true, but it works the other way too. If you have certain Supreme Court decisions or edicts of kings telling you this is the way morality is, people do, whether they admit it or not, they follow the leader. But the basic reason can be reduced to the word lawlessness. He says, a man might be a thief, a murderer, an adulterer, and could not in a strict sense be an offender. The worst of actions could not be evil if a man were a god to himself, a law to himself. Okay, so what he's saying is that no matter what alternative you set up to God's law, you're going to be a law to yourself, and every man will be a law to himself, or whoever has the most power. And that power can be achieved by a majority of people, so that's no safeguard at all. So you either have God's law, or you have the situation in the Judges, where everybody does what is right in his own eye, and what happens to Israel every time? Get carted off. They get defeated. But the most serious danger to each man for atheism is to face God's wrath. And he talks about that as well. Okay, second use. Charnock does not mean a lament for this simultaneous growth of atheism with institutions of the gospel. That's kind of what it sounds like when he describes it as gospel. He not just reasons growth, he talks about there being a gospel growth. And you're thinking immediately that what a shame that, this is what he's saying, what a shame that atheism would grow as it was in his day. At the same day that the Reformation had just happened, Puritanism was winning, at least for a time, but atheism is rising together with this growth in the gospel. That's true, but that's actually not what he winds up talking about in that section. He's talking about the growth of one's reason. In other words, what you claim about your growth in reason in your own soul. You know, it's just like Romans 1:21, professing to be wise, they became fools. Charnock calls atheists worse than heathens, partly because in order to actually suppress the knowledge of God, Romans 1:18, he says they must despoil themselves of their humanity. And that fits the description of the rest of Romans 1. And what he does here instead, he goes through basically something of a version of Pascal's wager and concludes that it's not reasonable for a creature who will not put himself upon such a reasonable arguing. He says, can such a person say he has done all that he can to inform himself of the being of God or of other things that he denies? In other words, if he won't even so much as say, well, if God doesn't exist, but I do that, whatever, I don't lose as much. If God does exist, but I don't serve him and I live for pleasure, then I go to hell. If you know what I mean? Pascal's wager, those 4 different possibilities. If he exists and I do this versus that. If he doesn't exist and I do this versus that. So Charnock basically does something like that. Who knows if he had Pascal in mind? He was 40 years after Pascal wrote that. But he does something like that, and he says it's not reasonable at all. When you listen to the atheist, he's not read the other arguments. He's not considered these things. Thirdly, Charnock includes in this the discipline to study God in the creatures as well as in the Scriptures and view God in your experiences of them. Now, he's not holding that as an alternative to Scripture. You submit those to Scripture. But confirm this, test this in all areas of life, is what he's saying. Fourthly, then this is really practical atheism applied to worship. This is Romans 1:21 replayed in the life of every individual. This intensifies guilt. In other words, if you know more and worship less, you're more guilty. And finally, to the fifth use, this is really the flip side, positive worship with the mind. He says, he who has given us the faculty whereby we are able to think should be the principal object about which the power of it should be exercised. I mean, think about it. Who gave you your mind to think? God did. Then what should our mind be most occupied with? Charnock is saying, I'm thinking the one who gave you that mind, otherwise you're ungrateful and you're abusing that mind. Okay,